So today we are very happy to have Karen Margulis as our speaker. She lives in Atlanta, Georgia with her husband, Michael. Karen is a full-time artist and an art educator. She is a contemporary landscape painter and works in most painting media. She has exhibited her award-winning work around the world and was recently recognized by Pastel Journal for her wildflower paintings. Karen has a passion for travel and painting while on location. Karen is also an avid daily painter. She shares her work, her tips, and inspiration in her daily posts on her blog, Painting My World. She enjoys the opportunity to share her techniques and approach in making art. Karen is known for her ability to make art simple, accessible to all, and fun. Today, Karen will present tips for painting beautiful wildflowers by sharing her story as an artist, some of her paintings, and a pastel demo. So welcome, Karen.
Hey everyone, I hope you can see me.
I think, Casey, you might check. We're still getting her.
I was visible and then I went away and now I'm just a blob. So I don't know what happened.
Have you tried to start?
Okay.
Oh,
there we go. Can you see me now?
Yes.
Yay. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank you for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share with you today. I'm really excited about sharing the wonderful world of pastel with you. And whether or not you have used pastel before or whether that's your main medium, I hope today that I'll be able to share with you some of my tips and techniques and maybe get you excited about trying pastel if you haven't done that already. So what I'm going to do for this presentation today is I'm going to first of all expand a little bit more about me, about my bio, my art journey, where I'm at today. And then I'm going to take some time to share some of my paintings and talk about them and the techniques that I like to use for pastel. I'll share a little bit about the pastel medium. And then I'm going to take that information and put it all together and show you a quick pastel painting demonstration. And then if you have questions afterwards, we'll have some time for questions and answers. So without further ado, let me just expand a little bit upon the introduction about a little bit more about me and how I got started with pastel. First, I got started with art back when I was 5 years old and won an art competition, but I'm not going to go that far back. That's a little bit too far. You don't really want to know that. But the quick story is I dabbled with oil painting and acrylic painting in high school, but I ended up getting a degree in elementary education. And then I got married, we had 2 children, and I decided to stay home with my kids, so I started a family daycare business. And that actually left me with little to no time to paint. And it wasn't until my kids got into high school where I then had a little bit more free time and I decided, you know what, it's time for me. I'm going to start painting again. This is back in 2005. I started with a watercolor class that, I don't know, it didn't fit me at the time. But then I discovered pastel. And the minute I tried pastel, I knew that this was going to be the medium that would best suit my personality as well as my current situation. And at the time I was still working full time with the daycare. And so I didn't have a lot of time to paint, but I did have enough time to take out a box of pastels and do something quick because it was easy to clean up. I think that was the main thing. That the reason why I enjoyed it so much, but I also liked the immediacy of it. In other words, you could pick up some pastel and some paper and in no time you could have a painting. And that suited me. I wanted like, I guess you could say, instant gratification. I found a local instructor. Her name is Marcia Savage, and she's a wonderful pastel artist. And some of you may know Marcia. And I started taking weekly classes with Marcia. But early on, in those early days, I was really, hold one second. I don't know. I put my There I am. I put it on do not disturb, so I don't understand why that happened. But anyways, back to my story. I was very frustrated early on with my paintings. I felt like I had these visions in my head what they should look like, and that is not what I was producing. It was frustrating because I had such high expectations, and I was really hard on myself. And I know in talking to people that we tend to do that to ourselves. We really have high expectations, and that made it frustrating. But fortunately, I had a friend who gave me some excellent advice, and I'm going to pass that advice on to you because it totally changed everything for me. She reminded me of the importance of practice. She reminded me that we all need to practice in order to get better at something. And it doesn't matter what it is, if it's a sport, if it's any kind of activity, if we don't put that time and in our case, time at the easel, it's going to be really hard to improve. I mean, if we've taken classes, sure, we're going to get better, but the more we practice, the more intuitive we will become. And the better we will be. So she reminded me, she said, Karen, you are going to a weekly class, and that's great, but you're leaving your box of pastels in the car. You're not practicing. It's going to take you a long time to get better if you don't practice. So she challenged me to paint a small painting, spend about 20 minutes a day for a month, and then to see what happened. And I did that. I had time. I painted during the kids' nap time. And I would do a 15, 20-minute painting. And sure enough, by the end of the month, I could see an improvement. Was I great? No, not by any means, but I could see that I had improved. And that was what was important. And it got me excited. And I decided, you know what, I'm going to keep this up. I'm going to be a daily painter. I'm going to paint something small every day. And at the time, this is 2005, daily painting was becoming a big thing. It was a movement. I don't if you could remember, maybe some of you even participated. Artists would paint small paintings and sell them on eBay or auction them off on eBay. There was daily painters websites popped up, and people were sharing their work on blogs. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to do that. I'm going to start a blog, and I'm going to kind of record my journey, and it will keep me accountable to this idea that I wanted to paint something every day. And that's what I did. And my blog is Painting My World. You can find it at KarenMargulis.com, but I have been blogging pretty much daily up until the last year or so, since 2005. So it is a wealth of content. The early paintings are basically my journey, what I was learning, how I was, where I was traveling, that kind of thing. But I would say about 7 years ago, things changed and I started teaching. And that was huge for me because it allowed me to start sharing what I had been learning over the last, few years. I'd been taking workshops and daily classes, weekly classes. So I had a lot that I wanted to give back. So I started to do that on the blog, and I started to teach in-person workshops. Fast forward to today, I am full-time painting, sharing now since COVID online. I would say that I would teach a in-person workshop every other month, but the last year and into this year, it's all been online. So I've done some online workshops, and I've been teaching online through my Patreon group, which I'll talk about in a little while when I talk about where you can find me. And where you can take classes from me. So here I am. I have opportunities to share what I know about pastel with you online, and also through my blog, through my website, and through my Patreon group and my YouTube channel. So that's pretty much it. I think if I could sum up my story and say anything to you, if you could take away one nugget from today, and it doesn't matter what medium you paint in or your art medium, is the importance of practice. I feel like getting better is there's a couple things have to happen. We have to study, so we have to take classes, we have to read books, watch YouTube videos, whatever it takes to learn about the basics of painting and beyond. But But in addition to that, we have to make time at the easel. We have to take what we're learning and put it into practice. And then we become a more intuitive painter. Things start to come together. The more you practice, the more you study, and the more you put them together, the more improvement you will see. So anytime I get a chance to get in front of a group of artists, I like to say, you know what, make sure you make time for practice. It's going to pay off for you. So I guess that's enough about myself. I want to share a little bit about pastel and then share some of my paintings with you before I do a demonstration. So there's a lot of misconceptions about pastel. As people who don't work with the medium sometimes don't know all about it, or you hear things and that's not necessarily true. So I want to clear up some of those things. I want to first of all start out by telling you what pastel is. Hold on one second. I had it on Do Not Disturb. That's so weird. Pastel is actually pure pigment, which is the same pigment that is found or used for oil paint, acrylic paint, watercolor paint, but it is mixed with a binder and a little bit of water. It is formed into a paste. That paste is then formed into shapes, either by hand or by machine. And you'll notice in pastel world, there are square pastels, round pastels, pastel sticks, pastel pencils, but it's all the same material, just pure pigment and binder, a little bit of water. Those shapes are left to dry and you end up with a pastel that you can apply to a surface. And basically what you're doing is you're working with a stick of pure pigment, and there's nothing in between you and your surface. It's just like you're holding oil paint in your hand and smearing it on, but it's dry. Because the binder is not a liquid binder, pastel will never crack or yellow or fade or change color. What you see is what you get, so you don't have to account for anything when you're working. What color you apply is the color it's going to stay. It's never going to change. And it is very vibrant and luminous, because if you were to look at pastel pigment under a microscope, you would see crystal structure, and that helps with the light. And so that you can't duplicate the luminosity of pastel because of those dry crystals that are in the pigment. So I think you can tell I'm really passionate about pastel. I think it is the most beautiful medium, and I do work in other media as well, but there's just not something about the luminosity and vibrancy of pastel that is really hard to match. One of the misconceptions though about pastel is that well, I already cleared up that it is pure pigment. It's not chalk. Chalk is dyed, a dyed substance. Pastel's not dyed, it's pure pigment. So you can't compare it to chalk. But also there are those who say that pastel painting is not really painting. I call it painting, but it's rather than painting, it's drawing. And what we say in the pastel world is that if you are covering the surface of your paper or your board, whatever you're working on, and it is covered with pastel, that is considered a painting. If, on the other hand, you do a sketch and you're not covering the entire surface, that could be considered a pastel drawing. So what I do is I cover my surface, and so then it can be considered a painting. And I mostly work with the pastel on its side and apply broad strokes of pigment. So that's kind of pastel in a nutshell. Oh, one other thing I wanted to say to clarify, a lot of times you'll hear people call them soft pastel, but then you might hear people say, oh, but that's a hard pastel. So what is the difference? So, soft pastel is just a blanket term for the pastels that we use to differentiate them from oil pastels. Oil pastels are a completely different animal. That's pure pigment mixed with an oil binder. So they're different. But soft pastel can range in how hard they are. Depending on how much pigment versus binder, you're going to have a stick that is hard meaning it releases less pigment and it's less expensive. Or you can have a stick on the other end of the scale that's very, very soft and releases a lot of pigment because it doesn't have as much binder. So if you're familiar with pastels, the Sennelier pastel would be considered on the very soft end of the scale, and New Pastel brand would be a very hard pastel. I like to work with all of them, but I tend to pick the softer ones, but not the super soft ones. I save those for the final marks. My favorite pastels are Terry Ludwig pastels, and I'll talk more about that when I do the demo. I think that's all there is to say about pastel. I'm going to answer one question because I always get this question. How do you frame them, and do you need to use fixative? I personally do not use a final fixative on my paintings. I use workable fixative to build up layers, and that's simply for my personal technique. But the sanded papers that we have nowadays hold on to the pigment so well that it's really not necessary to use a final spray. And in fact, some of the sprays will change the color, darken the pigment, and I don't want to risk that. So I don't. But the pastel paintings do need to be framed under glass for protection. You can frame right up against the glass. That's a French framing technique. Or you can use a mat or spacers. I do both types of framing, but I always use museum glass so that there's no glare. And that way you don't have that glass in between you and that wonderful luminous pastel pigment. So I think that should answer the questions that most people ask me about pastel. I want to now share some of my paintings with you. Maybe I can move this a little bit closer, and I'm going to hold up the paintings too so that you can see them. All right, I'm going to start off by sharing a little 9x12 pastel of a poppy meadow. Oh, and I should say this about my subject matter. I am primarily a landscape painter. That's my favorite subject matter to paint. But in the landscape subject matter, I am most drawn to wildflowers. Any kind of tangle of weeds alongside the road that's the thing that gets me the most excited, strangely enough. And those are the subject matters that I've had the most success with, both in sales and getting recognition and exhibitions and that kind of thing. And that kind of speaks to the idea of painting what you love. If you paint what you love, you're going to paint with more passion and excitement, and it will show in your work. So when I discovered that I like weeds, as my husband would tease me, I kind of stick with it. Obviously, that's not the only thing I paint, but I am going to share some wildflower paintings with you today. So here's a poppy meadow. This is done on sanded pastel paper. And I want to show you the kind of step-by-step technique that I use. This is one way that I start a pastel painting. And that is, I don't know if you can see this. You know what I would really love to do, and if this is possible, and you guys can let me know, is I would love to take pictures of my visuals and then somehow email them to the group. And you guys can let me know afterwards. That way you can see them a little bit better. I'm happy to share these visuals with you. But this basically tells you the steps that I take. And I'm going to do a demo to show you this. I start off with a very simple drawing. And by the way, with pastel, we work similar to oil in that we work from dark to light, from thin to thick, meaning thin, harder pastel layers, and then get to those thicker, juicier marks towards the end. And I personally like to work from very simple and gradually add the detail. So this is what I call the no-fail approach to a pastel painting. It's where I do a value block in using 4 values of one color. So here's my little scene, my poppy meadow, and I have 4 values of violet. The next step that I take is I blend all of that in and make a very soft underpainting. And I do that to get rid of the color of the paper so it's not a distraction. But I also like an out of focus underpainting so that I can decide where I want to put the focus and create a visual journey for the viewer. We'll go to the next one over here. The next step is where I take out the softer pastel sticks and I start by reinforcing the dark areas And then I go and paint the light areas, which is the sky. And in the next step for the poppy meadow, I mask the flowers. So I don't want polka dots. I just want big, large areas of flowers. And then finally, I get into the detail. So I gradually get brighter, more intense colors and a finer detail with the paint, with the pastels. All right. The next painting that I want to share with you, let's see. Again, if I can take pictures and share these with you, I'd love to do that. This painting is just to show you, and it's 18 by 24. Let's see if you can see it there. I'm going to move it closer in just a second. But it's basically just to show you the versatility of pastel, not only in how we can do underpaintings and how we can apply the pastel, but how we make our marks. Now, when you paint with oil or acrylic, we call that brushwork. In pastel, we call it mark making. And pastels are wonderful that we can get such a variety of marks with sticks, whether they be square, whether they be round, whether they be pencil. You can manipulate sticks to get a variety of marks. And I think for me, I like to have a variety of marks because marks to me are expressive, but they also help describe things. I'm going to move this a little bit closer so you can see the marks. And I have a variety of chunky marks for the flowers. I've got some linear marks for the grasses. And in the trees, you can see linear marks as well as broad marks that I use the side of the stick to accomplish. So this painting just showcases, to me, the versatility of pastels and the ability that we have to make many marks very easily. Now, what I shared with you just a second ago was the no-fail approach, a dry pastel application for the initial block-in. But we can what I love about pastel is how versatile it is and how we can mix them with other media. One of my favorite underpainting techniques, the way I start a painting, is with watercolor. And I'm not a watercolor artist, but I really enjoy working with them. And they make a good marriage with pastel. And by the way, in the pastel world, to have a painting considered pastel and not mixed media, you need to have at least 80% coverage of pastel. So if I were to do a watercolor underpainting, if it were to be accepted into an exhibition, I would have to then have at least 80% pastel on top of it. I want to move this closer to show you how I start a watercolor underpainting, not in a traditional way, but instead I start from dark and go to light. So I want my darks as dark and rich as I possibly can get them in the underpainting stage. And that will allow me to preserve the beautiful effects of a wet watercolor underpainting. Here's the next step where I start the flowers. I add some washes to the background. I leave room for the flowers, and I'll talk more about that in my demo. I add a little more shadows to the flowers, a little more detail, play around with the watercolor, and this would be then the final underpainting. A lot of times with the underpainting, I enjoy so much that I just want to leave them alone, but I always use them as a base for pastel. And I enjoy doing a wet underpainting because it really allows me a lot of freedom and it helps me to loosen up. So if you tend to be a very tight or controlling painter and you want to loosen up, pastel is a great medium for that. But to do a wet underpainting really kind of takes, you're no longer in complete control. Here would be a finished painting with a watercolor underpainting. And I don't know if you can see, but I tried to leave a lot of the underpainting peeking through some of those drips and colors of the underpainting. But I have 80% coverage at least of pastel on top of that. But yeah, watercolor underpainting is one of my favorite techniques. But you could do a wet underpainting with any medium as long as it's thin enough to not clog the tooth of the paper or surface you're working on. So you can even use oil paint, acrylic paint, inks. You can also use pastel and wet the pastel with water or turpenoid or rubbing alcohol. Yeah. Here's another example of a watercolor underpainting on a sanded board. By the way, I like to use sanded pastel papers, which are archival papers. You wouldn't want to use sandpaper from the hardware store. It's not archival. And this is a work in progress. I do need to add the pastel on top of this, but I wanted to show you another example of a watercolor underpainting. This would be that same scene with pastel on top. I've painted it before for demos, so this is a finished version with pastel on top of that underpainting. And you probably can't really see very well the little things that I have attached to this board. I was asked to talk about my workshops and what you would learn in my workshops. And one of the things that I love to do is simplify. I like to take the complex things that we learn about how to paint, value, what we need to paint well, such as value, color theory, how to create depth, edges, all of those kind of things. And I like to simplify them. So I like to give little goodies. And so all of these things that you see here are the goodies that I would give in my workshops. And if you were to come to my workshops, you would learn what they are all about. Now I want to show you one more, and then I'm going to do a demo for you. This is a step-by-step for a Queen Anne's lace painting. And basically it's the same as I showed you for the very first step-by-step, but that was a meadow. Here we're going to zoom in and get up close and personal. And that's something that I really love to do with my paintings, is zoom in on some wildflowers. Here's the 4 value block in using 4 values of red violet. Here I've rubbed it all in, rubbed in the first layer. Now I've started to block in the dark areas, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Putting in the lights, which is the sky. Starting to block in the flowers. And then here's kind of the in-between ugly stage. And then finally, this is the finish, final details where I add the spices, I call them. And again, I'll talk about that. So what I want to do for you is do a quick demonstration painting in which I'm going to do a up close and personal Queen Anne's lace. So very similar to what I just showed you. And I think what we were going to try to do is reverse the camera angle so that my husband can zoom in with the camera so that you can get a better view. So let's see if we can flip the camera around. Okay, so now you're in charge of that. We make videos for YouTube, and it's kind of like learn as you go. So hopefully we are usually working with a different camera for the YouTube videos. So hopefully you'll be able to see. And let me take a quick drink before I begin. Okay, let's talk first about the materials that I'm using. Can we see this? Okay, so I'm going to be working on a 12 by 9 piece of sanded pastel paper. This is called Pastel Matte. It's paper made in France. It feels smooth, but it's a cellulose fiber sanded surface. So it really grips the pastel very well. You're not going to have a lot of dust. So if you're concerned about dust, Pastel Matte is a good surface because it really grabs onto the pastel. One of the things that I keep is a folded piece of foam core to collect the dust. I also work on an easel that is completely upright. So any dust that I do generate is going to fall down into the tray. And one thing that I do want to say about pastel and dust, if you're concerned about, should I wear a mask? Do I need gloves? The pastels that I use are not toxic. The particles of pastel dust are heavy, meaning you will see them fall down. That means they're heavy enough to fall down. They're not floating in the air. So you're not really breathing them in unless you blow on your painting. And something that beginner pastel artists often do is they're painting and then they blow. You're then putting that dust in the air that you might breathe. So really that's a precaution that you just never blow on it. Your dust is going to fall straight down and you'll collect it in a tray. Okay, the pastels that I'm going to use, I'm going to start off by using some hard, can you see it here? Closer? Okay, I'm going to start off by using some hard pastels, meaning more binder, less pigment. These are Rembrandt pastels. They're inexpensive, and a lot of beginners like to get a set of Rembrandts because it allows them to get more pastels, more bang for your buck. However, it's hard for them to give you those really soft, juicy, thick marks that you might admire in pastel paintings, but they're excellent kind of workhorse pastels, and I'm going to use them for the underpainting. The softer pastels that I'm going to use are Terry Ludwig pastels. Now these are handmade pastels, handmade by Terry Ludwig, his staff in Littleton, Colorado, so made in the USA. They are fantastic, perfect amount of softness and firmness, meaning they're not going to crumble and break when you use them. The square shape allows you to get a variety of marks, and so I really love them. And I was fortunate enough to be asked to put together my own set. I don't know if you can see this. This is the floral landscape set. So I put these colors together to allow me to paint flowers in the landscape. But I have discovered since using the set that it is very versatile, and I can paint just about anything with this particular set of colors. So that's what I'm going to use for the demo today. All right, now, here's my reference photo. This is just a close-up view of some Queen Anne's lace. I always like to begin with a plan. So anytime I start a painting, I make a plan so that I can plan to let go. I do a quick value thumbnail using grayscale markers, and I kind of get an idea of where my values are, where my darks are, where my lights are, and my composition. And you can see here, I'm going to just use a pastel pencil. I'm not looking at my reference photo for this initial block in. Instead, I'm looking at my little value thumbnail. And by the way, this is a really great way to start a painting, especially if you tend to get too caught up in detail. If you want to loosen up and you want to be more expressive in your painting, then one of the ways you can do that is by not looking at your reference photo when you start the painting, but instead look at your, I feel like we need another guy right here. It's not in my thumbnail, but something told me I need to have a little balance right over here. So I like to start off with a very, very just quick, rough sketch. If something, when I paint flowers or clouds for that matter, if they're going to be larger than an inch on my painting, then I make room for them, because I don't want to make it too dark, because in pastel we paint dark first and light goes over dark. But we have to be careful that if it's really light, we don't want to layer too many lights on top of dark, because it could mix together and make mud, dirty color, and we don't want that to happen. One of the beautiful things about pastel is the layering, so we can lightly layer colors together, and we can get much more interesting color. So I'm using the hard pastel and I'm blocking in the dark areas, and I'm looking at my thumbnail to see where the dark areas are. And you might be wondering, well, why is this dark right in here? And the reason why, and I don't see it in my reference photo, maybe a little bit, but I know that I need to really push the darks in this underpainting stage, because a couple things, we want there to be some dirt, I like to call it dirt, to hold the flowers in place. We don't want them to be floating away. And we want to work from dark to light, and it's much harder to put the dark on top of the light. So start with the dark and make it as dark and rich as you possibly can. Then I need to put in the lightest area, which is going to be the sky. So I'm basically going to try to use 3 or 4 values of this red violet. And then I need some color over here in the, I call this the dirt. It's really simply going to be the areas that are underneath all of the green. So we're going to have a lot of green grasses and stems and that kind of thing. And I could paint just green. I can go right in right now with green, but I also know that it's not going to be as interesting if it's just the local color. And with pastel, I can very easily layer color together. So I am going to take this additional step of putting this red violet, because I know that if I have a red or purple with my greens or underneath my greens, I'm going to have much more interesting and lively greens. Now I'm going to put this middle light value where my flowers are. I'm going to throw in a few extra flowers because I really want to get this kind of great collection of tangled weeds, if you will. Now I can move into the softer pastels. So basically what I have to do now is reinforce the dark areas. So I'm going to come in with a dark red violet and very lightly go over those dark areas. So this dark, I actually call this the foundation pathway, or call it the dirt, just as a reminder that I need to have it nice and dark and rich in the underpainting. We can layer pastel, but we have to use a light touch. So I like to remind myself that the right touch is a light touch. So now I'm going to take a dark blue that is the same value as that red violet and very lightly layer it on top. Now you might be asking, if you were very observant, you might be asking, well, Karen, you didn't blend in that first layer like you did in your samples. And the reason why is because I'm working on a middle value gray surface, not a very light surface. So I don't mind where this middle value surface peeks through. It actually works just fine. Now I'm going to add a dark green, layer a dark green on top because that is actually the local color. So I have now all of my darks reinforced. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the light, which is the sky. And I really like this blue sky day with maybe hints of clouds. So I'm going to take a nice blue sky, blue, and I'm going to bring it down a little bit further than I want it to go because I know that the sky is going to get lighter and warmer as I come towards the horizon. So I start off with a darker blue, but I'm actually modifying it and making it a little bit lighter. And I want to make it a little bit warmer. So I'm going to pick a warmer blue as I come down to the horizon. But I'm going to pull it up into the darker blue there so that I don't have a, I like to call it a parfait. We don't want a parfait. And then I'm going to just add a glow of a pale yellow at the horizon, kind of to indicate maybe some clouds. I can actually add some of that pale yellow. Now, typically when I work with pastels, I like to pick my palette out in advance, and I'll take a butcher tray and I'll choose all the colors that I want in advance so that I have a limited palette. With pastel, you can't really mix new colors. You can layer to get optical blends of colors, but you really can't mix new colors. But what you can do is layer colors together on top of one another, and that gives a optical blend so your eye actually perceives different colors. So while on the one hand, we feel like we need to have a lot of pastels when we work with pastel, because we don't, we can't make red violet, we can't mix it. But on the other hand, we run into trouble sometimes because we have too many colors. And when we have too many, we get chaos. So I like to limit my palette. But when I work with my set, I find that it's already fairly limited, so I can have some control over my palette. So what I'm doing right now is I'm adding in the distant stuff. So I want to create a little bit of depth even within this close up. So I'm adding a kind of a gray blue, making some chunky marks to indicate some of the flowers that might be further in the like in the distance. And then I'm going to go with a lighter value of that gray, blue gray, and just modify those marks a little bit.
Hey, Karen, a
Yes,
question.
sure.
As you're doing this, does the color transfer from your painting onto the pastel as you layer?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really does. So if you are going over, if you have a dark and putting it into the light or the opposite, that's why I keep this dish towel on my shoulder. So I give it a swipe usually. And
Okay.
then it cleans it and then I can move on. Sometimes it's not really noticeable, but if you're going into a really light area with a dark, and you've been in a dark area, you definitely want to wipe off the pastel. So that's just a habit I get into. You pick up a pastel, you want to wipe it off. All right, now moving on, I've done the light, I've done the distance stuff, I've done the dark. Now what I want to do is add more color to the dirt. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go in with some really nice, warmer, kind of salmony red colors. First of all, going over the dark area. So I established this pathway, but now I'm going to cover it up because I want it to be visible, but I don't want it to look like a sidewalk. I want it to be subtle. So I'm covering it up right now with a light layer of pastel. And you might think, well, why did you bother putting it in if you're going to cover it up? But you'll notice that while I am going to cover it up, it still will be visible, but in a more subtle way. Just bits and pieces of the dark will be poking through, and that will hopefully give a framework. You also might be wondering, well, you haven't done anything to the flowers and it's all about the flowers. So they're covered up. What's happening? I am now to the stage where I think it's time to put in some of the flower color. So I'm going to start. Typically what I like to do is start off with the darkest color that I see in the flowers. So I'm going to put in a kind of a middle value, darkish, warm green. When I'm putting in flowers, I always want to keep in mind, I want an interesting arrangement of shapes, sizes, direction. I don't want them to all be going in the same direction unless it's like a super windy day. That's boring. So as I am layering these flowers, I keep that in mind. I think I'm going to add a little bit of peach to these flowers as well. Now, one of the things that I try to do throughout a painting is as I said, use a super light touch. I want to use a light touch throughout the painting process, but when I get to a certain point, and I'm not quite there yet, but when I get to a certain point, I start to press much harder. Oops. And I call that shouting. So up until that point, I whisper, and then I press harder and I shout, and I get different marks that way. I emphasize things in a different way. Just checking on my time. Okay, so here I have, this is what I would normally call the ugly stage, but I have a layer of pastel over the entire painting. And now I'm ready to start to add the detail. But before I do that, I'm going to take some workable fixative. This is Blair, very low odor. It's called very low odor, and it is very low odor. And I'm going to give a very light spray. If you make it too heavy, then it gets slick and you can't get pastel on top of it. But a very, very light spray does a couple of things. It fixes the darks in place so that now when I go over the darks, they will remain nice and dark. And I will also get a very, very subtle feeling of texture. I'm going to come in and start with my distant grasses, and I'm going to use a cool blue-green. I need to exaggerate the feeling of depth within this close-up. So I'm using cooler, duller colors and less detail in these distant, in the grasses that are kind of in the background. But as I come forward, I'm going to actually, let's go ahead and make a little bit more dark areas here. And as I come forward, I can start to use brighter greens, more intense greens. This is a nice grassy green, typical grass green, but I also want to use warmer greens, so greens that have a little more yellow in them, because we would have more warmer colors in the foreground. Now you might say, well, but you just covered up all your flowers once again, and you're right, that's true. I'm going to come back and revive them, but I'm going to first put in a few kind of dried flowers. Now here's kind of, I don't know if you could call it the trick for close-up wildflowers, but it's something definitely you want to keep in mind. And that is, you don't want them all to be sitting on top of your grasses. So I'm burying some of them purposely. That was a shouting mark. See, when I press hard like that, that's a shouting mark, that's a whisper. But I am going to bury some of those flowers so that I can create a feeling of depth in these grasses. If I didn't bury some of them under the grass, I would end up with flowers that look like I pasted them on top of my grass. I'm adding a pale yellow. That's the same pale yellow that I used in the sky. And notice I'm right now still using the side of the pastel and making some very broad marks. But as I start to come to the conclusion, I'm starting to press harder and I'm starting to add more detail. And I'm trying to think about how the viewer might read this painting. Where would the eye go? And that's where I'm going to add those details. Now, we are at the stage where we have floating flowers, so they need to have stems. So I'm going to pull out, I call this the grass box. It's a selection of hard pastels. Let me find the right, they're not organized. And I like it that way because that way I don't rely on the same colors for every single painting. That'll work. Now I want one a little bit darker. Here it is. So I'm going to paint some stems. First of all, I know I need to have a darker bottom to some of these flowers. So this is a harder pastel stick, so I can get a finer line, but I don't want balloons. So I'm going to do some stems, but I want them to be dancing in the wind. And so I'm doing broken lines. So to do a broken line, I'm going to press and release so that I can get, I call these lyrical lines sometimes. If I were to press down too hard, I would have just these balloons floating in the sky, and I don't want it to be that way. While I have my grass box out, I'm going to go ahead and use it to make some leaf shapes, some other linear marks, so I can create some grasses. changing the pressure and the direction of my marks, pulling some of the grasses on top of the flowers. Remember, we don't want the flowers to look like they're floating. I can pull some grasses up into the sky so that I can get that point of view that I'm interested in. And this part here may look like much like scribbling, but it's, I guess you could say it is like scribbling, but I'm really actually mindful about where I make those scribble marks. The idea is I'm directing you in and up into the painting and coming in and adding, oops, that mark is too light, so I don't really care for that one. So with pastel, it's super easy to make corrections. So one of the things you can do to make a correction is brush it out. Usually use a brush to brush it out, come back in and cover it up. We can wash it off. Pastel's very forgiving, which is also a good reason to embrace it. Come back with some of the softer pastels to get some different marks. And now I'm going to come in at the very end of the painting. And typically what I do when I'm doing a demo or when I'm painting on my own is I let the painting rest. I go get a drink, I come back with fresh eyes so that I can see where do I need to add the detail? Where do I need to add more clarity? How is the eye moving throughout the painting? And then I come back and I have a punch list and I write down the things that I want to address. One of the things that I want to do now is I want to reintroduce the colors that are in the underpainting and put them into the flowers. So I added that salmony pink back into some of the flowers. I could be a little bit more detailed with some of the main flowers and create some linear marks. Remember, pastel's very versatile in the way we can make our marks. We can also come in if we want to and add some chunkier, more intense marks. Again, trying to create movement for the eye around the painting. And then a fun little touch that I like to do is in demos anyways, because it's just fun to show you, is add a little life to the painting. So let's add a couple of little bumblebees. So I take my darkest pastel that's in the box. Let's add 3. Put in the dark, and then we need to add some of the yellow. So I'm doing some shouting marks, right? So I talk about whisper. Shouting is when I press really hard and I get a nice thick mark. And then he needs some wings. So let's get a little pale blue. Oops, let's get a little bit lighter value there so you can see some wing action. And of course we could come in and refine that, but for the sake of the demo, I think you get the idea. Come in with a few more blades of grass. I like to introduce the underpainting color. We might see some, in a scene like this, some clovers. Queen Anne's lace and clovers is a great combination. You can probably see that I'm fairly lenient about how I use my reference photo. My reference photo is mostly to give me inspiration, to bring me back to that place and to help me remember what it was like or what it felt like. And then I can go ahead and make the painting, you know, have the level of detail that I'm comfortable with. I love the quote by Degas who said, even in front of nature, one must compose. And that just reminds me that just because it's that way in the reference photo or out there in nature, doesn't mean I have to copy it exactly. I can do things to make it my own and to make it into a more interesting painting. So I think that pretty much does it for a demo, just to show you both the versatility of pastel, layering, using underpaintings, dark to light, thick to thin, broad areas to detail. And that's pretty much how I do it.
Well, thank you so much, Karen. That was outstanding.
Well,
Right
thank
now,
you.
do we have any questions that weren't sent through chat? Anyone?
Yes. I wondered, Karen, will you be doing in-person workshops in the next year?
Yes, I'm working on my schedule for 2022. And so I don't have it worked out yet. I'm talking to some people and hope to do some in the Southeast for sure.
Mhm.
And when I do have that, I'll announce it on my website, of course. And I'm about to transfer over to a new website, and that will give you a chance to sign up for notifications and that kind of thing. I'm not quite there yet.
Great.
It's a work in progress, but you can
Okay.
always find information on my blog.
Thank you. And I have another question. How does watercolor work on sanded pastel paper? Doesn't it wrinkle or buckle?
Great question. There are some sanded papers that will wrinkle and buckle unless you mount them. So you can, have them permanently mounted. You could do it yourself. You could have it done. They sell sanded boards that you don't have that problem with. But there's a fairly new paper out called Lux Archival. It's a white sanded paper, and I've been testing it. It does not buckle. You don't have to mount it. So, just use it as it is and it won't buckle at all. UArt paper, that's the paper I use most frequently, will buckle if you're too liberal or too wet, so if you kind of can control the amount of wetness, the paper won't buckle.
Okay, so that's Lux, Lux?
Yes, archival is, I think it's one word.
Lux Archival. And the name of the other one was again?
Is UArt, capital UArt. And that is sanded paper, comes in several grits. The higher the number, the smoother the paper.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What is smooth paper?
Smooth like sandpaper, not as rough, not as gritty.
Which is better?
Oh, it just depends on what you like. Yeah.
I have a
And whether-
question.
Okay, Muriel.
I'm wondering what kind of pencil was used initially to
Yes.
draw in the shapes, the
It's
original.
just a regular pastel pencil, but I use whatever's handy. So I will do an initial drawing with a regular pencil. The trick is to use a light touch, because this paper that I use, pastel matte, you can easily dent it. So if you press too hard, you'll get indentations. But you can use a regular pencil. You don't have to use a pastel pencil.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Yes, Karen, do you always use a complementary color as your underpainting?
No, that's a great question. Actually, I do a 3-day workshop on underpaintings, and we play with underpaintings, and we talk about what colors we use and why. And there's no right or wrong choice, but I do tend to like to use those warmer colors, the reds and the oranges, when I know I have a lot of green, just because of the complement and the exciting, excitement that you get. But it tends to give to me a sunnier feeling. So if I want a moodier day, I might use blue, or I might use purple. So it depends on my subject, really, and and what I'm trying to achieve.
Okay. And how do you sign a pastel painting?
So I sign, I take the sharp fortunately, I'm only using my initials, so it's easier, but I take the sharp edge of a hard pastel and I get a nice line. Or you could use a pastel pencil for the same thing.
Okay.
Either way.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you again, Karen, for sharing your story, your beautiful work on your wildflowers, and the pastel demo. And
Well,
as a
thank you.
follow-up,
Yes.
I'm encouraging everyone refer back to the program page on our website where there's links to Karen's webpage where you can see more of her work and contact her regarding workshops. And Karen, I'll ask you, as you mentioned, if you want to send the photos to me or
Yes.
to Casey or both of us, either way, we'll make sure it gets sent to our, or available to our members. And
Okay, I'll take care of that today.
okay, great. And also, everyone, please feel free to provide your feedback about our meeting. And we're always looking for improvements or different art mediums to share. And this is a great example of something we haven't done in a while. And it was excellent, Karen. Our
Thank you.
next
It was a
meeting is
pleasure to share.
Okay, thank you. Our next meeting is May 20th. Karen Winkle, Professor and Director of the School of Art, Craft, and Design at Tennessee Technological University, will provide a gallery walk. Kimberly will select several pieces of artwork from our online spring art show and share her artistic insights. The May meeting announcement is posted on our website and an email to members will be sent soon. So thank you again, Karen, and everyone, please have a great day. And thank you for your attendance and your participation. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.